Hey kids, welcome to our next unit, America, a New Nation. During this unit, I'm going to be telling you how our first presidents took America from revolution to the world stage. We got some really interesting questions to answer during this unit, so listen up, here they are.
Why did corn farmers hate George Washington? He seemed like a good enough guy. Did John Adams really hate aliens? That's kind of spacist. Did Thomas Jefferson make pirates walk the plank? Because if so, respect. Did a woman named Dolly really save some of our most precious national treasures? I mean, her name was really Dolly?
Those are the questions for this unit. We're going to get started today with George Washington and those corn farmers. So, put on those floaties. We're going to dive into that lake of knowledge. See you there. Today we're talking about George Washington. Yes, the George Washington. No, not George Washington the general, or George Washington the statesman. We're talking about George Washington, the President of the United States. In fact, the first President of the United States. Now, when you think of George Washington, you probably think of this perfect leader who everyone loved. However, reality was different. In reality, he had his enemies, Thomas Jefferson being one of those. They disagreed about a lot of different things. Another enemy was Thomas Paine, the guy that wrote Common Sense that convinced many colonists that they shouldn't want a king anymore. He, in fact, wrote a letter to George Washington stating that he prayed for his death. One group of Thomas Jefferson followers accused George Washington of being paid by the British throughout the entire war. They said he was a Benedict Arnold, or a traitor, who just never got caught.
So, while president, George Washington obviously had to put up with people saying things about him, telling him horrible things like they wish he was dead, and even making up stuff about him. But today, we don't think of George Washington that way. We think of him as one of our greatest presidents. So, what made George Washington such an amazing president?
What if you were wanted? In fact, everyone wanted you to form a club. You had to figure out how to get people to join, what kind of club it was. You decided on soccer. You had to form the teams, schedule the games, design the uniforms. And as the season went on and everything turned out, people loved it. They were very impressed with this soccer club you started. That's fine and dandy. Again, what if you go into the future, a couple hundred years? You come back and you notice, well, gosh, things are a little different. There's still a soccer club. They are kind of doing a lot of things the same way you did. In fact, they're scheduling the same way. They're choosing teams the same way. They're using the similar types of jerseys that you designed, and people really like it. In fact, there's a portrait of you on the wall, and it said Founding Father. Now, that would make you feel pretty good that you created something that years and years later was still loved and enjoyed and thought of as really well made. What really makes George Washington amazing is that he created what the presidency is today, with the cabinet, his advisors, and many of the things he set up are still observed by presidents today. Now, with all that happening, you would think, well, George Washington, really, can you compare him to anything? We're going to give it our best shot today in Compare and Contrast. So today we're comparing George Washington to a head of lettuce. Sorry, that's all I had in my fridge. So you'd first think, George Washington, a head of lettuce, they have nothing in common. However, if you look closely, you will see they both have a head. Now, if you look a little closer, you'll see the lettuce has no body. Very unfortunate for the lettuce, very fortunate for George Washington, who is known as the father of his country. You think there's nothing else that could have in common, but if you look, you'll see they have the same hairstyle. Yes, I think George pulls it off a little better, but very similar in their look. Now, the lettuce needs to be refrigerated. I would think George would be a little cold on that idea. But Washington did something lettuce never could do. He gave up power when he didn't have to. The only reason why lettuce couldn't do that? Well, lettuce never really has power. Now, they both enjoyed dressing up for dinner. In fact, George Washington was known for throwing some of the most extravagant parties in the entire town. Now, as much as Washington enjoyed dressing up for dinner, the lettuce pulls off a ranch dressing like no one else. I mean, pizzow. Finally, Washington was an expert equestrian, meaning that he could ride a horse like nobody's business. In fact, back then, being able to ride a horse really well like Washington did was kind of like being a sports star today. It was seen as the height of athleticism. There you have it. There's our compare and contrast for today. Up next, why did corn farmers hate George Washington? There's an angry corn farmer right there. Let's ask him. Well, he said that the states after the war still had war debt. And in fact, in some spots they had a lot of debt, and in other spots they had a little bit of debt. And that was basically the North versus the South. In the North, where most of the war happened, there was lots of debt still left over. In the South, they had a little debt. In fact, a lot of the states in the South had already paid off their debts. Washington thought it would be a good idea for the U.S. government to take out a loan and pay off all the states' debts. Then, they would put a tax on whiskey, known as a sin tax, because it taxes something that's considered sinful, to pay for that loan. Everyone in the entire country would have to pay that tax, even from states with little or no debt. Most people in the states with little or no debt were against this. They didn't like the idea. It was especially true for corn farmers in the South. And the reason why was corn farmers in the South, especially an area known as the backcountry, which was in the Appalachian Mountains, did not like this because they would take their extra corn and turn it into whiskey. And then they would trade that whiskey to other people. And when they traded that whiskey, they would then have to pay a tax, which would take away some of their profit, and they didn't think that was fair. In response to this, they decided they would grab their pitchforks and actually revolt against the U.S. government. Now, I think we actually have a clip from that. I have come to put down the rebellion. Well, General Washington, I will tell you this, there is no rebellion. They heard you were coming and all went away. Very well, that was easy. Finally, we come upon Washington's farewell address, and this is when he left office for the last time, and he was telling everyone what he thought the country should do. First of all, he said, keep working together. Don't divide into this North and South stuff. He'd already seen it with the Whiskey Rebellion. He didn't want that to go any further. He also said, trust the government we have created. We've created a good government. It does things well. He also said, don't get involved in other countries' problems. He knew that Europe was just a mess of problems waiting to happen, and that if America got involved, it would just cost us blood and treasure. Finally, don't form political parties. He hated political parties. He would not be a part of one. He didn't think they were right. He thought they would create factions between different people. And as we look back, he was pretty darn correct about that one too. So Washington had a lot of good advice to give to the people of America. Some of it was followed, others of it was not. So what? So after watching today's video, you should be able to tell someone what made George Washington an amazing first president, why corn farmers got angry at Washington, and how the problem was solved. And finally, what George Washington's advice was for America when he gave his farewell address. If you got all those things down, then you'll learn what you need to.
Tune in next time to find out why John Adams hates aliens.